don't squat below 90 degrees because it's bad for your knees. And I know you're thinking, wow, Harry, that sounds like something Joel Seedman would say. And you're right, that probably is something he would say. So I don't know about you, but I'm feeling bloody educational today, and I feel like this is going to be an exceptionally informative video. And I already pre-teased this video in the last video I did where I spoke about lean beef patty and her training. And it's obviously going to be next in the TFNL Growth Guide series, and we're going to look at the quadriceps, so the quads, which is obviously the big juicy thigh muscle at the front of the thighs, which you will likely see when you're rocking your summer clothing. Obviously, I did mention before that I'm going to start releasing original content videos every 2 weeks instead of every week, but instead I'm going to try and mix and match them a bit more. So I'm going to combine the growth guide video and the exercise tier list video into one, because it essentially ticks both of those boxes without having to upload them as separate videos, especially considering a lot of the information does overlap, so it does make sense to do it this way. And that's exactly what we're going to do today. A few things before we start. Obviously, know what's going to occur. If you decide you like this style of video and perhaps want to learn more about resistance training and other bits and bobs, please let me know you like the video by dropping a like on the video. 1,300 likes is the goal, so if we reach that, that'd be bloody splendid. We'd very much appreciate it. If you haven't already, please do consider clicking the red button down below to subscribe to the channel, and maybe even the bell next to it so you get notified when I upload every week, twice a week. And if you have a question you want me to answer at the end of the next video, please do consider dropping it down below in the comment section for comment question of the week, and I shall do so. So I do have a hat today, but I spoke to a friend, Max, I see you, to separate this kind of series from my other videos. He suggested perhaps I don't wear a hat for this style of video, but maybe perhaps if you tickle this idea too, I could wear something like a lab coat, because it's quite a science-based video. What do we think? So we're going to talk about a few things. What are the quads? So the quadriceps, like I said, the big muscle on the front of the thighs. And obviously quadricep, shortened down to quads, refers to four muscles of the quads, because obviously quad means four. Rectus femoris, so the rec fem, that middle muscle you often see. You've got the vastus intermedius, which is a muscle that sits underneath the rec fem. You've got the vastus lateralis, which is the outside of the quads. And you've got the vastus medialis, which is the inside, kind of like the teardrop muscle of the quads, because you see here, it looks like a teardrop, hence why people often refer to it as the teardrop. And the kind of basic principles which I cover in all of these videos still apply. And I'll quickly run through them very, very quickly. Basic stuff when looking at hypertrophy, you want to train 2, if not close to failure, so 0 to 4 reps in reserve. 0 meaning you've hit failure, 4 meaning you have 4 reps until failure. Resting as long as you need until you're fully recovered and ready to go again, which is often about 3 to 5 minutes provided your intensity is there. 5 to 30 reps per set. And we're going to kind of cover a few things. We're going to cover, first of all, what do you need to do to work the quads? And essentially, the quads are contracting when you are extending the knee. So when you are straightening your leg, the quads are contracting. So typically when considering quad movements, you would look for movements that allow you to straighten your leg against load. So that could be squat variations, anything along those lines, like lunges, split squats, regular squats, hack squats, all that good stuff. And there's all actually a big myth and a misconception that's been lingering around the industry for years. And I have many a PT say this to me, and actually many of my instructors when I was learning to become a personal trainer myself would often preach this during like PT school, and they would say, don't squat below 90 degrees because it's bad for your knees. And I know you're thinking, wow, Harry, that sounds like something Joel Seedman would say. And you're right, that probably is something he would say. But the reality is, provided you are healthy and your knees are in good condition, squatting below 90 will probably not be bad for your knees. Essentially, your muscles can go through a range of motion and you can go through a range of motion. Going through your full range of motion, completely fine, because it is your full range of motion and your active range of motion. So the range of motion that you can go through comfortably and naturally without forcing yourself into position using additional load, whatever it may be. So if I were to say to you, stand up and do a squat as you are, how low can you go with your heels still on the floor? That is probably your active range of motion. And your range of motion can be improved by gradually over time going through a slightly greater range of motion. So let's say your leg pressing loads over time, going a little bit deeper and deeper and deeper. Eventually your range of motion and kind of like mobility, flexibility will improve. Other things can help with it, like improving your ankle mobility, all those good bits and bobs. But the short answer is this: no, squatting below 90 is not bad for your knees. What we really want to try and achieve is a full range of motion. Your full range of motion may not be the same as my full range of motion, because not everybody can comfortably comfortably squat with their bum to the floor. If you have really long femurs, for example, which is the upper leg bone, typically you may find it significantly harder to squat deeper. You may have to implement a bit more of a forward lean, which is absolutely fine. Just understand that your body has its range of motion based on your leverages and skeletal structure, and that's okay. You can improve it to a certain extent, absolutely, but if you do have long femurs, you may never be able to squat bum to the floor, but just because you can't doesn't mean you can't go through your full and active range of motion. The second point I want to cover, which is again is a big myth and misconception that has often floated around the industry, your knees should not pass your toes when squatting. And this is something that we've been hearing for years. And again, this is not the case. In many cases, to squat to your full range of motion, your knees may need to pass the toes. If, again, you stand up very quickly and you squat to your bum as close to the floor as possible with your heel plant on the floor, you can obviously get so low. Now stay in that position, but then go onto your tiptoes and see if you can squat a bit lower with a bit more of an upright torso. That elevated heel there, almost similar to wearing like a lifting shoe, with a raised heel, can almost make up for some lacking ankle mobility you may have, which will also encourage your knees to travel a bit further. And ultimately, when you're looking at training the quads, especially in their lengthened position, which we're going to get to shortly, you want your knee to bend as much as it can. And to increase how much it's bending, you may need to allow your knees to travel quite far forward. But again, provided your heels remain on the floor, that's not an issue whatsoever. And when considering like maximizing quad growth, I would certainly consider a lifting shoe, even if your ankle mobility is fantastic, just to potentially give you even more range of motion. Because essentially when you take the quads through their full range of motion and you fully flex the knee, so fully bend the knee, so you really stretch the quads out, that's a very good time. And obviously I've spoken about this before, where I said about working the muscle in its shortened position, where peak tension of the movement is when the muscle is most contracted. So for example with the quads, it will be when the leg is straight, and the lengthened position in which the peak tension is when the muscle is most stretched. So for the quads, that may be at the bottom of a squat perhaps. Both of those are obviously very key to positions to train in, because essentially you want to avoid redundancy by ensuring you're training the muscle through all of its positions, including shortened and lengthened. The quads are one of the muscle groups that particularly benefits from something referred to as stretch-mediated hypertrophy. And that essentially refers to lengthened position movements. When you're training the muscle in its lengthened position, you are doing so to almost tick the stretch-mediated hypertrophy box, which is an independent driver of hypertrophy. And that's essentially stretching under load. Like I said, lengthened position. So movements like that would be all your squat variations, your leg press variations, things like that. Things where you can get really deep and there's a lot of tension on the muscle when you are very deep. But then they also, like other muscles, the quads also benefit from something called metabolite accumulation, which is essentially what you achieve, the box you're ticking when you're training the quads or a muscle in its shortened position. So obviously when they're most contracted, which again is another independent driver of hypertrophy. So if you could tick both of those boxes where you're training the quads in their lengthened position, like a squat pattern perhaps, and their shortened position, like a leg extension movement perhaps, you're already off to a great start. And in all honesty, you don't need to do an excessive amount of volume for the quads. Let's say you're training your legs twice a week. Typically, I wouldn't do a quad only day. If I'm doing a quad dominant day and a hamstring dominant day perhaps, I would still include hamstrings on the quad day and quads on the hamstring day, because ultimately you want to give your muscles multiple opportunities to grow per week, so you train them twice per week, let's say, or maybe even more. So just doing quads on one day and hamstrings on the other, even if you're accumulating the same amount of volume, it would likely be better to split that volume a bit over 2 separate days. When doing a leg day, perhaps, I would typically probably not do more than 5 or 6 movements, and that would be including calves. If I were to just do a quad day, which again is unlikely, but if I were to just train quads in one day on their own, I would typically only do 4 exercises because I think that is plenty. And I would ensure those exercises place a good amount of emphasis on different areas of the quads, so different muscles of the quads. And I would also ensure those exercises train the quads in both their shortened position and lengthened position, for the reasons previously mentioned, being metabolite accumulation and stretch-mediated hypertrophy. And now we're going to kind of quickly go through some movements which I think are bloody splendid for the quads, some movements which I think they are fine for the quads, and other movements, when considering hypertrophy, I probably wouldn't include for the quads. Again, I'm not covering every movement in the world, and I'm not going to turn it into a tier list because I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I'll be throwing demonstrations or examples on screen so you know exactly what I mean when I'm referring to each of these movements. And so the big thing to remember or consider when looking at like quad movements or lower body movements in general is how safely can you take that movement to to failure. And what I mean by that is if you're doing like a squat, for example, typically for confidence purposes, whatever other reasons, you may find it harder to take the squat to failure in case you drop the bar, whatever it may be. Maybe safety as well is definitely a consideration. Whereas if you were to swap that out with a similar movement that's more machine-based, so for example a hack squat, arguably you could say that would be better for the quads because you can take that movement to failure in a safer manner. So let's think about the top source, top tier, absolute good stuff movements. I would tickle those as primarily squat and leg press variations, depending on which ones they are, obviously. So these movements I'm about to say are going to be bloody fantastic for the length and position of the quads. So we look at the hack squat. When looking at quad hypertrophy alone, I would arguably say it's better than the back squat because of how safely you could take it to failure. I'd also say a pendulum squat, very similar story to the hack squat, bloody top 2 quad movements I would say when considering the lengthened position of the quads. Leg press, again bloody fantastic, especially provided you are going through a full range of motion. I see a lot of you, including myself for a long time, half wrapping the leg press thinking you could load up a load of weight. I'd much rather do the movement to a higher standard, so take it through a full range of motion and have to decrease the weight but yield better results in doing so. Another great movement is, you know I'm going to say it, and you know I don't want to say it, but I'm going to have to, is a quad dominant split squat, where you're obviously elevating the back foot and elevating the front heel so you can get additional knee travel, so additional knee flexion to further lengthen the quads. Bloody splendid. It's also a unilateral movement as well. And the final on the list, the big one, which I would say is one of the best quad movements in there, and also the best shortened position quad movement in my eyes, the leg extension. A very simple machine many people have at the gym. No other movement allows you to shorten the quads to such a degree. It also allows you to shorten the rec fem to a high degree as well, especially if you lean forward slightly, because the rec fem is the only muscle of the quads that crosses at the hips as well. So additional forward lean at the hips, so a bit more of a hinge, can further shorten the rec fem when you are going through a leg extension. Get into your normal position, lean forward slightly at the hips, and go through the leg extension range of motion. Like I said, you'll further shorten the quads, and it'll be even harder with that forward lean. And when you maybe get really tired, you can't do any more, you want to get a few extra reps, lean back a bit, and you'll probably be able to get some more reps, but you won't be able to shorten the rec fem as effectively, which is why it becomes a bit easier. So I would say those are my 5 top tier favourite movements for the quads. And to be honest, you could actually probably chuck in a Smith machine squat into the mix as well if you wanted to. Then we go down to what movements, they're fine for the quads. They're not bad whatsoever, but they're probably not my favourite. And that would be something like a back squat, because obviously I mentioned this earlier about the proximity to failure and the safety side of things. Maybe a lunge, perhaps, because obviously it's really hard to elevate your heel when doing a lunge, therefore the range of motion might be a bit limited. A sissy squat, again, it is a good length and position dominant movement, especially when considering lengthening the rec fem, but it's just personally not one of my favourites. And also a step up. I think a split squat is a better alternative. Although the step up is still good, it's still fine, it's just not one I would choose as my top tier source ones, you know? And then we flip around to movements I consider, I'm never going to say it's a bad movement. I would say a movement that's probably less than ideal, or perhaps not favourable when considering quad hypertrophy. And the big 3 that come to my mind are both the front squat and the goblet squat, because both of these have the same limiting factors here, which is another consideration when training any muscle group. When doing a front squat or a goblet squat to failure, other muscles will likely fail before the intended muscle fails. So like I said, when considering the front squat and the goblet squat, your arms may give out, your core may give out, another area external to the quads may give out and reach failure before your quads can reach failure. Let's say you do front squats and your shoulders give out and they hit failure, but your quads are still at 6 reps in reserve. Although you've reached failure of that movement, your quads have plenty left in the tank. Therefore, you're kind of missing out on some good gains there. And another one that, to be honest, it's more of a variation which I see a lot of people include, especially in the gym environment, pulse movements. They do indeed hurt a lot and they do indeed burn a lot, which is cool, it's a fun time in a lot of cases. I guess that depends how you define fun. They are very much just maintaining tension. They are not taking you through a lengthened position or a shortened position. They're just kind of hovering. Therefore, they're not really the best kind of movements to include for the quads. But if you were to do a home workout, which I'm going to get to shortly, or something similar, I would maybe understand it a bit more. Obviously, I already said I probably wouldn't do a quad day. I would probably do a leg day that includes hamstrings and glutes as well. But if you were going to do a quad day alone, I would actually probably only tickle 4 movements. That would be a squat variation. So let's say in this case, I do a hack squat to start. Perhaps 2 to 3 sets of about 6 to 10. I probably wouldn't go above 10 reps because I feel like your breathing will probably give out before your quads do at that point. My second movement would probably be like a leg press variation or just a standard leg press. And obviously to place greater emphasis on the quads when doing a leg press, we want to maximize knee flexion. So how much the knees are bending and almost how far they are traveling. When looking at the plate of the leg press, to really bring the juicy quads into it, we go low and narrow. and obviously point your toes out a little bit to help that range of motion. I'd probably do a similar sort of thing, 2 sets of maybe 6 to 10, 8 to 10 perhaps. Could maybe push it up to 12 if you wanted to, but I typically do prefer lower reps here. After that, I might consider a quad dominant split squat. I maybe do, let's say, 2 or 3 sets, probably 3 sets of 8 to 12 each leg, maybe 10 to 15 each leg. A big thing here, which I've only recently been introduced to, thanks to individuals like Ryan Jones and JPG, is ensuring that you're resting between legs. Because when you're doing a split squat, although you're considering the front leg to be the working leg, that back leg isn't quite resting. Because as you're going down through that range of motion, you are actually lengthening the back rec fem. Therefore, it's not actually resting. And JPG did a really good post, which I'll probably put on screen or link below, surrounding high and low threshold motor units, and how if you basically go straight from the left side to the right side, you may be missing out on some potential gains due to the difference in motor unit recruitment. So typically when doing any kind of single side movement, upper or lower, I do try and rest between sides. And lastly, for the good old shortened position of the quads, I would tickle something like a leg extension. And I would probably do higher reps here, so maybe 3 sets of 12 to 20 perhaps. We've covered the lengthened position plenty, we've covered the shortened position, we've covered tickling multiple muscles of the quads. We're bloody laughing. That is it. And you'll notice with all these kind of workout structures, they all typically follow a very similar structure. So usually about 2 sets of lower reps for the first 2 movements, 2 to 3 sets of slightly higher reps, like mid-range reps for the third movement, and probably about 3 sets of higher reps for the final movement if it's a full exercise day. Because it's tried and tested, it's very effective, and it doesn't need to be overcomplicated. And that actually brings us straight on to comment question of the week, which is very appropriate for this video. I've watched several of your videos about at-home / weightless workouts that have alternatives for shoulders or abs, and I'm curious what you'd suggest for somebody who can't afford the time or money to go to the gym but still wants to do a leg day at home. What exercises would you recommend? Again, I'm going to assume that you maybe have some bands and maybe some dumbbells at home, in which case you could do, so for the quads, you could tickle movements like a wall sit, sissy squats, wall hack squats, which I'll hopefully be able to show you via a video on screen. You could also do banded leg extensions, again, hopefully there is a video on screen. Step ups, lunges, split squats, those are some fantastic quad movements you could do at home. We could maybe consider doing movements that I would maybe not favor typically, so you could consider like a goblet squat as well if you wanted to. So you've got loads of quad alternatives there. A lot of those movements would be quite good for the glutes as well, so split squats, lunges, step ups, etc. But in addition to that, you could do glute bridge or hip thrust variations, all sorts of stuff like that. Then when looking at the hamstrings, again, like I say, if you've got dumbbells, you could do RDL, so Romanian deadlifts. You could almost do some more of like a stiff leg deadlift variation if you can get your dumbbells to the floor. You could do banded good mornings. You could do leg slides with like a towel underneath your feet and sliding to replicate like a leg curl motion. You've got loads of options and loads of room for variation, which is a bloody good time. So just because you're at home doesn't mean you can't put together a bloody effective leg day. And like I said, for a leg day at home, I'd probably tickle anywhere from about 5 to 7 exercises. Probably actually I would say 5 to 6 exercises if you're considering the glutes, the quads and the hamstrings. But I would try and do so multiple times a week, so maybe 2 times a week, or maybe reduce volume and maybe train them 3 times a week, whatever you're able to recover from. And that's the kind of the key thing, is I give examples of sets, reps and exercises. That's just an example off the top of the head that I would probably include for myself. But again, that's because I can recover from that. If you aren't able to recover from that, you could do 1 set, you could do 2 sets, you could do 3 sets. It's completely up to you. There is no right or wrong. It's about what you are able to do, what you're able to remain consistent with, and what you can recover from, and also what you enjoy. But hopefully that gives you some tips and tricks for your at-home workouts, and hopefully that answered your question sufficiently. But to be honest, that is it. That is the video. Like I said at the start of the video, 1,300 likes is the goal, so if we could reach that, I would really appreciate it. If you haven't already, please do consider clicking the red button down below to subscribe to the channel, and maybe even the bell next to it so you get notified when I upload every week, twice a week. And if you too have a question you want me to answer at the end of the next video, drop it down below for comment question of the week, or DM it to me if you prefer, and I shall do so. Thank you for tolerating me. Thank you for tolerating my lack of headwear, and hopefully, maybe, depending on what you say, soon to be featured lab coat, and thank you for tolerating the video.